Recording in progress.
Right, hello everybody. Good morning. I can't hear you, but I hope you can hear me. Welcome to another Monday morning history. Um, as you will see, we've been doing this for some 3 or 4 months now, and I've suddenly decided I don't need to clamber all over Judy first thing in the morning. If I sit in the right place and adjust the screen, we don't have to make a struggle of it. I'm a slow learner, I'm sorry. Right, nothing more to say except to say I should turn Judy around so you get the full vision of her, and I shall withdraw. Thank you, Judy.
Does that need to go any nearer?
You can go nearer, yes. That's it. You're off.
Right, good morning everybody. I hope you're all well. And if my nose is running and I need to use my hanky, it's not because I've got COVID. It's a result of when I fell downstairs and broke my nose rather badly. So please don't think I've got COVID. I haven't. Oh.
Sorry.
Oh, right. All right, just funny things happening to the screen. Right, so Queen Victoria's reign, which as you know was very long, but not as long as our present Queen's. Isn't it lovely the way the Queen responded and was all funny and kind of appearing to be happy? I don't suppose she's really happy having lost her husband, but putting on a really good show. So this is the reign of Queen Victoria continued. And one of the most important things that happened in the middle of her reign, of course, was the Crimean War. We heard, ordinary people didn't hear of course, but the politicians and the statesmen heard in 1853 that a long way away, it seemed in those days, a long way away, there was a conflict in what was always called the Holy Land in Palestine, an ongoing conflict, been going on for years and years and years, between the Roman Catholic French monks and the Russian Orthodox monks in the Church of the Nativity. It was all to do with who held the keys. It was a petty situation, but it had escalated into something that wasn't petty at all. It had become a serious issue. And the Russian army decided that they were going to march to protect the holy places from Islam. It had become a serious issue, and we always kept a wary eye on Russia, because Russia at the time was in an expansionist mood, as she appears to be again today. And so we were very suspicious about Russia's involvement, claiming to be the champion riding to protect Christianity from Islam. And by October, Turkey was at war with Russia, and we were neutral. We had decided, I say we, politicians had decided, that our best position was to remain neutral in all European conflicts. We would either be peacemakers, or we would just stay well out of whatever the trouble was. And we would just concentrate on trade routes and just becoming more prosperous. So we were neutral. And then there was a very dramatic and upsetting incident where some 4,000 Turkish sailors were killed in the Black Sea, where the ships were, and they hadn't done anything to provoke this. It was the Russians being very aggressive, the Russian government being very aggressive. And all of a sudden there was what's called war fever. I think we all know what war fever is, although usually, generally speaking, the British were not accustomed to war fever. We weren't that kind of a volatile country, at least we didn't think we were. But every so often there was sort of public outrage at something that had happened in another country that offended people to such an extent that they were willing to fight. What we call war fever, which is like a fever, very infectious. It spreads very, very quickly through the population, so that people that are normally peace-loving and calm and sensible get caught up in a kind of frenzy. We must punish the perpetrators of this terrible outrage, this massacre, or whatever it might be. And so hatred of Russia swept the country. We'd been suspicious of Russia for a long time because she was in an expansionist mood, trying to move into the Black Sea area, which of course belonged, the other side of the Black Sea belonged to Turkey, so it was an ongoing conflict area. But we had kept out of it, as I said. And we got a situation rather like 1938, 1939. We got a peace-loving Prime Minister. We wouldn't say pacifist, but Lord Aberdeen had been a sort of disciple of Robert Peel's. The Queen and the Prince liked Lord Aberdeen, partly because he was Scottish. They liked all things Scottish by then. They were prejudiced in his favour from that point of view, but also that they felt he was a safe pair of hands. He was a cautious, very sensible, peace-loving man. And the equivalent, so he was a bit like Neville Chamberlain. And then we've got the equivalent of Winston Churchill. We've got Lord Palmerston, who'd been Foreign Secretary when the Whigs were in power. And they weren't in power anymore, but he was on the sidelines saying, this outrage, we need to take sides on this. We can't just say we're neutral and we're sitting on the sidelines and we're not partisan. We are partisan. This massacre of these 4,000 Turkish sailors is a war. Well, they didn't use the word then. They didn't use the phrase war crime, but that's what they were implying. It's a war crime, and it must not go unavenged. So we got on our moral high horse, and war fever, you could say, was encouraged by Lord Palmerston. He was a very powerful, very charismatic politician, and he urged armed support for Turkey. So he said, we must take sides in this. Now, some people were very nervous about this, saying, why are we allying ourselves with an Islamic country? You know, remember the Crusades. And also, the Turks have a lot to be embarrassed about. They're very, very similar to today, thinking about China. The Turks have a lot to answer for. Their prisons are absolutely appalling. They still believe in torture. They are not a country with which we should be allied. So there was controversy, great deal of controversy, but the growth of xenophobia was irresistible. And to many people's surprise, we ended up with strange allies, very strange allies. We were allied with Turkey and France, our ancient enemies. For hundreds and hundreds of years, they'd been our enemies. Against Russia. And we've been allied with Russia in the Napoleonic Wars. So this is a complete reversal of our standard traditional foreign policy. Took a lot of people by surprise, but we ended up with strange allies and a strange opponent. So much so that Lord Raglan, who was in charge of our troops, kept forgetting that he was fighting the Russians, and he kept saying France instead of Russia, or the French. Let's have at the French. Somebody saying, my lord, they're our allies. We're fighting against the Russians. oh yes. He literally kept forgetting because he'd been brought up to be he was old. The French were the enemy. You know, they always have been. So he couldn't get his head around the fact that we were sort of, the French were our friends in this war and the Russians were the enemy. Found it really hard to grasp. Now, the awful thing that happened from the point of view of the royal family was that because this war fever is it's a very strange thing, war fever. It's not sensible and rational. It's passionate and emotional. That the press, followed closely by the public, decided that Prince Albert was not to be trusted, that he was foreign, he hadn't made any friends, he hadn't got a support group, he hadn't done any networking, it's called today, forming a support group. He was isolated, a loner really. He made no friends among the aristocracy. They sort of despised him. He had literally kept himself apart from making friends because he thought that it was dangerous for the royal family to have friends, that they could be manipulative or a bad influence, or the royal family could be accused of favouring their friends. I mean, it was for the highest, most principled reasons that he had never made any friends. Somebody once said, you know, the Queen was his only friend. Not quite true, but he hadn't developed a group of people who would be on his side. So all of a sudden he discovered that he was being accused of all sorts of things, spying for the enemy, and that he basically wasn't to be trusted. That he was sympathetic to the Russians. I mean, absolutely ridiculous. And all the popularity he'd gained 3 years earlier with the success of the Great Exhibition just evaporated. And some really quite sensible people were led into believing that he was not to be trusted. And even one of the papers actually reported that he'd been arrested and taken to the Tower of London. And it was printed as news. And of course, a lot of people, even today, if it's in print, then it must be true. I've seen it, it's true. So how appalling that the prince, who hadn't done anything wrong, and there was absolutely no basis for this belief, that's how wild people had become. How well, that's what happens with war fever. People will believe all sorts of stories, and somebody says something and other people run with it, believe it to be true. So Queen Victoria and the Prince were very, very deeply hurt by this, as you can imagine. Very deeply hurt. And it affected the Prince very much indeed. After all he'd done, learning almost better English than the Queen used, and all the things he'd done, devoting himself to this country, to be accused of treason was a stab in the heart. 50 volumes in the Royal Archives of dispatches, memoranda, letters, papers of all kinds, which can be read today, of course, working for this country, working for the good of this country. Now, how did they behave in the war? You could have forgiven them if they'd withdrawn and said, well, if that's how you feel, we're just withdrawing until the war is over. But not at all. They behaved impeccably. And this is the beginning of the royal family becoming involved with ordinary members of the public. That hadn't happened before. George III had mixed with people, but people just thought that was very eccentric and weird. George III didn't like dressing up, and he often wore quite simple clothes, and would just start talking to farm labourers. But people thought that was really part of his eccentricity and madness, that it was a really weird and peculiar thing to do. He certainly didn't get any credit for it, far from it. But this was a sort of policy, a way of behaving, which then continued to be part of the way the royal family treat their subjects. The royal couple reviewed troops leaving for the Dardanelles. Men had always done this, of course, because, well, certainly hundreds of years before, the king went with his troops and led them into battle. Now we've got a female monarch, but she actually dressed up as a soldier. And somebody said that the clothes she wore suited her better than her ordinary way of dressing, which was pretty dreadful. She got the most awful taste in clothes. She actually wore a tunic, a guard's tunic, and a cocked hat. She looked lovely. So they inspected the troops, and then, I mean, the Queen could knit. She'd been taught that as a child, and she knitted all these socks and mittens and scarves, and that was publicised, and people thought, oh, what a lovely thing to do. You know, that's what ordinary people do. That's what ordinary women do. They knit. How fantastic. Fancy her being able to knit. It was a small thing in some ways, but a very, very important thing when it came to restoring the reputation of the royal family. She wrote wonderful letters of condolence to people who'd been, women who'd lost their husbands in the conflict. Inspected hospitals, that was Prince Albert's idea. The Queen was quite nervous about going to hospital. She was frightened of catching something, but the Prince said, no, we need to do this. We need to visit our wounded troops in hospital. Several visits to Chatham Hospital, of course, it was all in the papers, and people gradually began to realise that these stories about Prince Albert were just that. They were just stories. There's no truth in them. The Queen sent a letter to Lord Panmure, the Secretary of State for War, saying that she didn't approve of Chatham Hospital, that it was she actually said it was dirty and dark and depressing, and what were they going to do about it, and that there needed to be more windows to let in fresh air. She was a fresh air fiend. Queen Victoria had an absolute obsession with fresh air. She meant cold air, actually. We'll come to that in a minute. She would believe that and also she said men who are seriously wounded need to be near the window so they can look out and see something other than the ward. And that was a really good suggestion, really practical, down to earth, sensible suggestion, that they should have a better view than just being stuck in the middle of the ward, looking at somebody else that was wounded and looking to look out for the bedclothes, and across the ward to somebody else that was lying moaning in pain. Put them near the window. Put them right by the window, and make the windows bigger. You know, change the hospital, and they did. They did actually. The builders went in, and Chatham Hospital was not transformed exactly, but modernised at the Queen's request. That was a personal intervention by the Queen. She loved giving medals out. She really loved doing that because she knew what to say. She was normally a bit stuck for words. Unless the Prince was with her, he always seemed to know what to say, even though he was talking in his second language. But when she gave out the medals, she did know what to say, and she was charming, said the right things. The wounded men were in raptures about how wonderful it had been that they had had a personal visit from the Queen, and she spoke to them by name. What a wonderful thing to do. This was new. This was a new departure on behalf of the royal family. She offered the royal yacht as a troop ship. She gave a lot of personal, from her own personal allowance from the civil list, gave money to buy artificial limbs and pay pensions for wounded soldiers, and often said that she would really like, if she wasn't the Queen, she really would have liked to become one of Florence Nightingale's nurses. She really wanted hands-on nursing experience. She was really at her best during the Crimean War. It has to be said that the royal family not only rallied round but went to extreme lengths to show how much they cared, particularly about the wounded men coming back from the front. And Lord Panmure said, "You never saw anyone so entirely taken up with military affairs as she is," and he meant that as a huge compliment. And Prince Albert, of course, benefited from his wife's growing popularity, and the criticisms and the false allegations just died a death. Just became a historical oddity that people could turn against somebody who had done so much 3 years earlier in masterminding the Great Exhibition. What happened in the Crimean War? The Peace of Paris, 1856, ended the war. It had dragged on far longer than anybody had anticipated. We didn't come out of it brilliantly well, as you probably remember if you've done the story of Florence Nightingale, and quite a lot of us probably did at school because she was a great heroine. If you went to a girls' school anyway, probably did learn about Florence Nightingale. And if you went to a boys' school, you probably learned about her anyway, because she came out of the war extremely well. The military leaders came out of it very badly, because they didn't seem to know what they were doing. There were all sorts of military mistakes made. The charge of the Light Brigade was sort of presented as something wonderful. It wasn't. It was an absolute disaster. Orders being misunderstood by Lord Raglan, men being sacrificed because he hadn't understood the orders and he didn't question them, just riding down a valley full of with Russian guns firing at the men all the time. It was splendid in regard of, it was, the men were incredibly brave because they could see what was going to happen, but they had to take orders. You know, in the army, you don't question orders, you obey them. You don't say, "Oh, do you think somebody might have made a bit of a mistake? I can see some guns at the other end. You know, they're going to fire at us. Do you think this is a good idea, charging down this valley?" Enormous number of deaths. Enormous number of deaths. It was, but always presented as something wonderful. You know, how brave and British, uncomplaining, obeying of orders, and disaster, but total courage. And of course the poem made that even more wonderful and heroic. So even in those days there was spin like there is now. You know, you sort of presented something as wonderful when in fact it was a catastrophe. At the end of the war, what did we gain? We gained Cyprus. We hadn't gone into it for territorial gain. We'd gone into it on the moral high ground to punish the Russians for what they'd done to the Turks. Florence Nightingale is the one that comes out of the war really well, because she set up a hospital in what had been a barracks, a Turkish barracks at Scutari on the other side of the Black Sea. The wounded men had to be taken from the battlefront right across the Black Sea. Many of them died on that voyage. You probably remember this from the story of Florence Nightingale. Many of our men didn't die of wounds, they died of enteric fever and cholera, because the hygiene was so dreadful. A natural disaster had taken place in the harbour at Balaclava, that the supply ships had sunk in a terrible gale, in an awful storm. So it was true that it wasn't entirely the fault of the British Army for not being prepared properly. But Florence Nightingale managed to get beds and stretchers and bandages and so forth, because what happened before she arrived with her 38 nurses was that men were lying on straw, just on the floor, on straw. They hadn't got beds, they hadn't got mattresses or anything, and they were still, their wounds hadn't been dressed 5 days after they were wounded. So very naturally the wounds had gone bad. Many of the men got gangrene. It was just absolutely chaotic and dreadful. and it's worth reading about how Florence Nightingale managed to redeem that situation using really the power of her personality. She managed to get the hospital. When they arrived, these 38 nurses, when they arrived after this very, very long journey from Britain, the Turks hadn't even prepared any quarters for them. So when they went to the rooms that had been allocated, although not prepared, they found a dead horse going rotten in one of the rooms that they'd been allocated. So they had to clear out the dead horse first before they could do anything else, and then start scrubbing the floors and the walls because they were filthy. It had been a barracks. They just hadn't been prepared at all. So, the Peace of Paris, Martin's found an excellent picture of everybody sitting around this table, a sort of portrait of all the people involved. Beautiful, again, Martin's found lovely pictures of the medals that the Queen and the Prince designed to reward, certainly Florence Nightingale, a beautiful medals and badges that she could wear. You probably know Florence Nightingale didn't like the publicity at all. She hated being called the Lady of the Lamp. She hated the publicity, and she actually became an invalid as a result of her experiences in the Crimea. She was having 3 or 4 hours sleep over many months, and became an invalid. She was sort of, we don't quite know what was wrong with her, but she sort of sat in bed, surrounded by papers and sort of explaining how to be a good nurse, and redesigning hospitals, etc., but was never able to be an active nurse again. Now, the most terrible thing that happened, jumping forward, during the war, Lord Aberdeen had had resigned, had gone into retirement early, and Palmerston had become the Prime Minister. Very much like 1938, 1939, 1940, where Chamberlain had to make way for Churchill. The royal family disliked Palmerston intensely. They disliked him very much indeed because of everything about him was wrong. Everything about him was wrong. They didn't like him because he was a Regency man. He was very confident, and he was very arrogant. Very arrogant. That's why they disliked him so much, because he wouldn't give the Queen dispatches that he was sending, letters that he was sending abroad, until after he'd sent them. And she was very indignant about this, and she'd look in her red boxes and discover a dispatch and look at the date and realise that it had already gone. She hadn't said it was all right. She hadn't given her permission. This happened again and again, and he was reprimanded again and again, and very, very contrite. Did a Boris. I'm really, really sorry. I won't do it again. I'm really sorry. I'm so apologetic. I don't know how that happened. And I blame his staff, blame his secretaries. It wasn't the secretaries, it was him. And he was always going to improve, and he was really sorry. And then, of course, he did it again, because he didn't see why he should be corrected by somebody whose schooling had been as bad as that of the Queen. He almost had contempt for the Queen. But of course, it was mainly Prince Albert who was spotting all these errors and saying, what an arrogant man he is. He thinks he's better than us. So they didn't like Palmerston for that reason. And his private life, again, we're a bit like Boris. He'd had a rather interesting private life. Regency men did. They took mistresses without really thinking about it. It was sort of expected of them, really, to show how manly they were. Man of the world. It meant mistresses. Well, the royal family, of course, had become bywords for the exact opposite, for total respect for their marriage vows, absolute horror when it came to anything, sexual deviance or wandering away from the marriage and being unfaithful. Absolute, particularly Prince Albert, because of his family background. His father was a serial adulterer. Duke Ernest was a serial adulterer, and when Prince Albert got old enough to understand that, was shocked. Treated his wife very, very badly, and when Prince Albert was only 5 years old, the Duchess, his mother, decided she couldn't stand it any longer, and she left the marriage and then took a lover. Her husband had taken many lovers, but it wasn't acceptable, of course. It was all right for the men, but it wasn't all right for a woman. So she became, somebody who was never mentioned. Prince Albert wasn't allowed to talk about his mother at all. She was persona non grata. So he grew up with a pathological fear of adultery and unfaithfulness. Pathological. So you can imagine what he thought about Palmerston, who romped through, being a typical Regency man, and romped through various mistresses. I wasn't a bit ashamed of it. That was what the royal family couldn't understand, that he wasn't ashamed, because men weren't in those days. The more the merrier. So they despised Palmerston, and it was almost mutual. Palmerston didn't respect them. So they weren't very happy about having to accept Palmerston as Prime Minister. Yeah. It's all right, I'm getting my papers all in a muddle. Martin's helping me out. If you saw a hand mysteriously appearing, Martin sorting me out. Now the Queen had liked Palmerston when she was first Queen. In his patronising way, he kind of taken her under his wing, and they used to play chess together. She played quite badly, but he's very patient with her, as you might be with a child. She was only 18 years old, and he was a man of the world, and he was really quite sweet to the Queen, and she liked him. She wrote in her journal what a lovely man he was, how kind and considerate, and so forth and so on. But that changed, of course, when she got married. She took her husband's opinion. She valued her husband's opinion so highly that if he said he didn't like somebody or said something disparaging, she went along with that without question, without thinking about it too much. She didn't stick up for Palmerston. She didn't say, "Oh well, it was really kind to me when I was young and inexperienced." They christened him Pilgerstein, and they demanded obedience regarding these dispatches, but he never improved. He was incorrigible. And in 1855, this is interesting because it could be happening again, following a motion demanding investigation into mismanagement of the Crimean War, moved by John Roebuck, it became famous. The Roebuck motion, showing no confidence in the government. Carried by a 2/3 majority. Poor old Aberdeen was out, Palmerston was in. And she tried desperately not to have Palmerston as a Prime Minister. She asked 2 other people and they said, "No, thank you. Lord Palmerston is the man. You need to send for Lord Palmerston. He's popular with his colleague." Well, actually, he wasn't that popular, but he needs to be... He's a bit like Churchill. Churchill had made enemies, but he was the man of the moment. So very, very similar to that situation. Palmerston became Prime Minister. He was over 70. He was deaf. Hearing aids in those days hadn't been invented. They used ear trumpets, but he wouldn't. He just had to shout. He was too proud to use an ear trumpet. He was short-sighted, but he wouldn't wear glasses. And he had very unreliable false teeth that kept popping out unexpectedly. Because false teeth weren't very good in those days. They had a sort of snap arrangement at the back, and they didn't fit onto the existing teeth very successfully. So if you opened your mouth too wide, your teeth kind of came leaping out. quite, they didn't fall out, they kind of jumped out because of this spring arrangement at the back for eating purposes. But he wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't the kind of, that generation, they weren't embarrassed. And he dyed his hair and whiskers, something else the king, the queen and the prince thought was disgusting, that he was fighting his age, he didn't like being old. Well, none of us like being old. He dyed his hair and whiskers. That was seen as quite disgraceful for a man to be so vain. But he was still charismatic and still full of vigour. There was nothing wrong with his mind. And to their amazement, they found him quite easy to deal with. They were so prejudiced against him, they were astonished to discover that during the war, and possibly because of the war, they began to see his good qualities. And one thing that had absolutely delighted the Queen was that Palmerston was one of the first statesmen to actually say that he recognised Prince Albert's very great qualities, his sterling value. And such a valuable comment to make. So this is Palmerston speaking about the Prince. I had no idea that he possessed such eminent qualities. He is an extraordinary man. How fortunate it was that the Queen had married such a prince. And the Queen was actually purring with happiness because this was a wonderful tribute from somebody whose opinion counted, somebody whose opinion was respected, and praise for her husband was in short supply. A lot of people just didn't like Prince Albert. He was stiff and cold, and he had a funny handshake, a German kind of handshake. He was uncomfortable with people. He didn't have small talk. He could talk about a particular topic or a particular subject, but he didn't really have small talk. He didn't remember people's names, and he wasn't. He was a bit like the Queen, actually. He was actually basically very shy. So this was wonderful, this tribute. So Palmerston's period as Prime Minister, which went on for a long time, they're sometimes called the Palmerston years, the middle years of Victoria's reign, not many major reforms. He was that generation that thought reforms were either unnecessary or they led to trouble. Once you started reforming, the working classes would get the idea that they got the upper hand and would start demanding all sorts of ridiculous things. So keep the door closed. That was the basic idea. Keep the door closed. Don't rock the boat. But that period of our history was noted for great prosperity, largely due to trade, overseas trade developing, new trading areas being developed, our empire expanding, our Royal Navy becoming more and more wonderful with more ships than any other country. Our Royal Navy sort of led the world. Peace and prosperity were the watchwords, the motto of that period of time. High employment, jobs for everybody that wanted a job. I hadn't got far to go to find somebody wanting staff, wanting people, and mines were expanding, cotton industry expanding, and we were exporting all over the world. We were sending our cotton goods to hot countries that needed cotton. Not everybody rich, of course, not everybody doing well, obviously, but a time of prosperity. The Queen found these years quite difficult on a personal level. She had her last baby in 1857. There'd been a gap of several years from her last child. The child before that was Prince Leopold, who, as you know, had haemophilia. And she called Prince Leopold her child of anxiety. She worried and fretted about Prince Leopold because he was little and thin and always it wasn't actually identified that he had haemophilia until he was 6 or 7 years old. He was just a child who kept falling and bruising himself and being ill and not gaining weight very well. They just didn't know what was wrong with him, and then when they did know, that was very worrying because he was life limited, of course. Amazing that he lived as long as he did. He did in fact live to be 30. I think I mentioned that before, that he did get married. They found a princess that would take him on, in spite of his health problems. Queen Victoria never thought he would get married. And one child born during his lifetime, and then his wife was halfway pregnant with the second child when he died. So he was life limited, but he grew to be an adult, which was amazing in those days, with a serious illness like haemophilia. So Prince Leopold was a constant concern. When she had Beatrice, the doctors they didn't tell the Queen, but they told the Prince that she shouldn't have any more children, because she suffered so badly from what's now called postpartum, not psychosis. She didn't have psychosis, but she certainly had depression after all her pregnancies. She called it nervousness or feeling low. Well, we would call that depression. So sometimes it took her a year to get over these pregnancies. The pregnancies themselves, absolutely great. She was very strong. Despite being only 4 foot 11, she was a strong woman. She didn't understand other people being ill. But she called it suffering from her nerves, or this phrase, feeling low. And during this time, she didn't seem to notice her husband becoming more and more stressed and ill looking. Other people noticed. Other people were really quite shocked, especially when he went home twice. Once with the Queen, and then on his own when his father died. He went back to Coburg, and the Coburgers were shocked to see how their handsome prince looked middle-aged before he was, looked up to 20 years older than he actually was. He was suffering from all sorts of different ailments. He'd never been strong. He'd been actually quite a delicate child. He suffered very badly from toothache. He didn't just get toothache. He got abscesses and neuralgia in his face. So never just ordinary toothache. Rheumatism set in at an early age. Headaches, indigestion. Now, obviously, in those days, they had no scans, they had no X-rays, they had no way of identifying really what was going on inside somebody's body. Nausea, terrible tummy pains, terrible pains inside, never identified. It's thought now that he either had some sort of terrible allergy, which of course was never identified, or he had celiac disease, or irritable bowel syndrome, or ulcerative colitis, something very serious, they believe now, because he'd been tormented by these pains, these terrible pains, for years, since he was a child, in fact. He always got terribly seasick, even just crossing the channel. Even if it was calm, he was seasick. So there was something wrong with his digestive system. The Queen had very little patience with him, very little patience. She was a hypochondriac herself. I mean, once she lost her husband, she became much worse. Hypochondria sort of set in big time. As an older lady, she actually would summon her doctor, who was a residential, 5 times in one night. She would ring her bell and summon her doctor because she couldn't sleep. That's how selfish she was. So you're probably thinking I've got my knife into Queen Victoria. I suppose I have it to some extent, because she really did think of herself, not more than other people. I mean, she thought her husband was absolutely fantastic and wonderful, as we know. But she really wasn't very patient with him when he was ill. We know that because she wrote to her daughter every day, sometimes again, up to 5 times a day, when she was worried about her daughter, when her daughter was pregnant. A bit like somebody sort of compulsively, obsessively sending emails over and over again. She wrote to her daughter very openly, with all her feelings, and saying, you know, dearest Papa is ill again. He always imagines he's ill when he isn't. That was unkind. And he always pulls such a long face so that everyone feels sorry for him, implying that he was putting on these illnesses, that he wasn't genuine. Well, she should have known him better than that. He was extremely genuine, and he wasn't an actor in any sense of, he couldn't act, and he certainly wasn't deceiving anybody. So he was ill and looking ill, and he wasn't getting much, he was getting sympathy from his wife, but not enough, because he was suffering probably several of these things at the same time, the rheumatism and the headaches and the pains inside, digestive pains. Now in 1861, 16th of March, the Queen's mother died. Now this is a sort of turning point really. She died of erysipelas. She'd been ill for a time, so it wasn't unexpected. The Queen had been a dutiful, good daughter. She'd been there every day. And when it happened, she completely collapsed in grief and cried and cried and cried and wouldn't stop crying. She just cried every day, all day. Now, it's very hard to imagine anybody being able to cry that much, to be honest. Where was she getting the strength from? Where was she getting the tears from? To be able to cry all day. And refused to accept encouragement from her by this time adult children, urging her to stop crying. It was upsetting everybody, particularly Prince Albert, making his life more difficult. And she actually said, one loves to cling to one's grief, which sounds very self-indulgent, which is what a lot of people thought. They actually ran out of sympathy and patience with the Queen because she went on crying and saying that she couldn't stand the children near her, she couldn't stand noise, she really put herself absolutely centre stage and demanded a great deal of attention because she was so heartbroken. To make some allowances for her, she was obviously feeling, a lot of people feel when somebody's died, guilty, very guilty, because of the rift that had taken place when she first became Queen, and she'd sent, sort of more or less exiled her mother to the other end of Buckingham Palace, and we know Buckingham Palace is huge. So she gave her mother apartments about as far away as possible from her as it was possible to be. Right at the other end of the palace. It was like rejection on a big scale. Because of the way she'd been controlled during her childhood, she was getting her own back. The fact that her mother had depended on Sir John Conroy. The Queen was punishing her mother. No question about that. She would have admitted it. But now her mother had died, she was full of regret, although they'd been reconciled for many years, since the birth of the first child. But she'd been a good grandma, doted on all the children, and been invited to family occasions. But there's no doubt that the Queen was much more upset than was natural, because she felt so guilty about the way that there had been this rift, and it had continued for quite a long time. But people at court were really very, very worried about her reaction, because she became absolutely adamant that she didn't want to change. It was almost as though she was being unfaithful to her mother's memory to stop crying. She got to show how devastated she was. And even Prince Albert found it difficult to reason with her. Just really difficult to get through to her. It was as though, well, love to cling to one's grief, that she would wake up in the morning and start crying. So this was like a foretaste of what she was going to be like if she lost her husband. A lot of people were feeling very nervous about this because they looked at Prince Albert and thought, he looks a really ill man. He looks awful. And they were speculating and thinking what on earth would happen to the Queen if she's so upset about her mother. What will it be like if she loses her husband? that she thinks is, well, she called him that perfect being all the time. So the children always say, that perfect being, you must be like your father, that perfect being, that angel. You know, she talked in very extravagant terms about her husband. How would she cope? Well, in 1857, going back a few years, the Queen finally gained the approval of the House of Commons. They'd resisted this before. She'd put this proposal before the House of Commons or Parliament many times, that she wanted her husband to be Prince Consort. And they'd turned it down. They didn't like Prince Albert. And it was a new idea anyway. It was a new concept. We'd never had a consort given that title. They were just married to the monarch. Usually a queen. We'd had a king, and so the Queen was the Queen. Interesting in view of the Queen's announcement about Camilla. Finally, 1857, the Queen got permission, and he became the Prince Consort. And in his mid-30s, he looked 10 to 20 years older, we said, stooped with rheumatism, losing his hair, but his face was what worried people. It was puffy, and not because he'd put weight on, although he had, but somehow ill. He looked sallow, and his skin didn't look very healthy, puffy and pale and unhealthy looking. Bad-tempered, irascible, not all the time, but irascible, sleepless, continuing to complain that he suffered terribly from insomnia because of all the weight of all the concerns that he had, because he was, as Disraeli said after the prince died, he was to all intents and purposes the king. He was carrying the burden of looking after this country in all different aspects, foreign policy, everything. And worried about the family. You know, he was worried about his son. He was worried about Prince Leopold. The new baby, the new child was like a blessing. He absolutely loved Princess Beatrice, and she was a cute little thing. She was the only one that really had the kind of strong personality to be able to say naughty things and get away with it. The others were sort of very much controlled by the parents, but Princess Beatrice was cute and full of mischief, really. She was the one that could blurt out all sorts of things and people would just laugh. And her parents would laugh. Well, they hadn't done that before with the other children. It was because there'd been a gap between her birth, between Prince Leopold's birth and Beatrice. Beatrice almost like an afterthought. And everybody sort of spoiled her and indulged her. And she reacted by being very confident and a little bit bossy and a bit full of herself, but in a cute sort of way. And the prince found great comfort in his relationship with his little daughter. And the Queen noticed this and thought it was lovely that he had this good relationship. And she was worried about her husband, but not enough. She didn't seem to realise that he was sinking under the weight of responsibility and the fact that he had to look after her. His physicians and the Queen's physicians had told him that this spectre of insanity was lurking all the time because of her grandfather, and she looked very much like George III. Physically, she looked like him. So the prince had that additional responsibility, that he got to keep an eye on his wife, and the way she behaved after her mother died suggested that she was. They actually thought in Germany that she had lost her mind. Quite open about it. You know, she's gone mad. She can't cope with bereavement. She's gone mad. But what particularly upset them was the behaviour of the Prince of Wales. They found the Prince of Wales incredibly difficult to understand. There's a whole chapter in this book about Victoria called The Disappointing Heir. Well, it was more than disappointment. And this is what the Queen wrote to one of her relatives, Crown Princess, to her daughter in 1859. Her daughter was living in Berlin. So when her brother was only 17, it was 17 years old, this is what the Queen wrote. I tremble at the thought of only 3 years and a half before us, when he will be of age, and we can't hold him except by moral power. I try to shut my eyes to that terrible moment. He is improving very decidedly, but oh, it is the improvement of such a poor or still more idle intellect. Oh dear, what would happen if I were to die next winter? It is too awful a contemplation. His journal is worse a good deal than Afy's, Prince Alfred's letters, and all from laziness. Still, we must hope for improvement in essentials, but the greatest improvements, I fear, will never make him fit for his position. His only safety in the countries is his implicit reliance in everything on dearest papa, that perfection of human beings. So if only he could be more like his father, he'd be all right. Well, he wasn't like his father, he was the exact opposite. He hadn't done very well in the army, he hadn't failed all his exams, but when it came to practicalities, he lacked command. And so he'd been marked down very badly because he didn't give commands loudly enough or with sufficient authority. So he hadn't done very well in military college. They were hoping that would be the making of him, but it wasn't. So they decided, the royal couple decided that his only hope, the only hope for the prince, the heir to the throne, was to get him married quickly before he went completely off the rails. It had been noted that he had that tendency, starting to notice pretty faces. And so they decided that they'd better hurry up and find him a suitable partner, a suitable consort. So the Princess Frederick, she was called, the firstborn, Vicky, in Berlin, was told to trawl through all the available princesses and duchesses in Europe, in Germany particularly, of course, to find a suitable match, a suitable consort for Bertie before it was too late. Get him married. And she trawled through it, she took it very much to heart, and very conscientious. Trawled through all these princesses, kept writing to her mother saying, well, she seemed ideal, and then I met her teeth are horrible and she's quite ugly, so no good. So really very interesting. But finally came up with Princess Alexandra of Denmark. Now, Queen Victoria wasn't very happy about the Denmark situation. She wanted a German princess, of course. That was the tradition. No, Princess Alexandra was absolutely wonderful. Vicky had met her. She was ideal. She was young. She was sweet-natured. She came from a family. They were royal, but they were very simple in their tastes, as were our royal family. She was very religious, but not in a fanatical way. Good living, etc., etc., etc. And so the couple were sort of introduced, and it was more or less assumed that this was an arranged marriage and that the prince would do as he was told and marry Alexandra, which of course eventually he did. But in the meantime, he went on manoeuvres. He went, as all the students had to do, to actually experience army life under canvas. Now, actually, they weren't literally under canvas, or he wasn't. He was in a hut, but it was a camp. They had to sort of look after themselves pretty much, and his fellow trainees felt really sorry for him. They'd noticed how immature he was, how inexperienced he was, unworldly for his age, and because they felt sorry for him, they decided to do him a big favour, and they smuggled an actress stroke prostitute into his hut. So when he came back from the training session, there was this attractive, very obliging, willing, experienced young lady waiting for him, and the inevitable happened. Several times, according to the prince's diary. And then she stayed on the campsite, and this happened for several nights. It was a total fall from grace. The prince was no longer innocent. And eventually, because she was calling herself the Princess of Wales and boasting that she'd seduced him, word reached the royal family, and Prince Albert was just devastated because of his pathological hatred of sexual shenanigans of any kind. He totally overreacted. The Queen was distressed as well, but she was much more used to it with the Hanoverian family to which she belonged. But Prince Albert was absolutely devastated. She later said that was what had killed him, and she blamed her son, totally unfairly, because this was just the last straw on top of many years of Prince Albert being stressed and worried and affecting his health, because the stomach pains would have been exacerbated by stress and concern. So the poor man decided he was going to go and see his son and remonstrate with him and explain to him what a terrible thing he'd done, that he'd endangered the royal family, the whole reputation of the royal family depended on exemplary behaviour, and he'd fallen from grace in the most dreadful way. So several times during the previous weeks, the prince had attended some function in the open air and got very, very wet and not changed his clothes. So he'd already come back to the palace shivering and cold and saying he couldn't get warm, and even in bed he said he was still cold, which suggested he got some sort of, he was ill, but refused to accept his illness. He was driven by duty, so he went on fulfilling his obligations, which was very, very full timetable, like the royal family today, you know, going here, there and everywhere, opening things, speaking in conferences, and so forth, as well as writing dispatches, keeping the Queen up to date, keeping her calm. She was still crying about her mother, but not every day, but then the slightest little thing would trigger it and she'd start crying again. That was his responsibility, to try and stop her crying, make her be reasonable. So he went to see his son, again got wet in heavy rain, counselled him, walked with him, and got him to apologise and grovel and say, you know, never do anything so terrible again. Returned home feverish, shivering, refused to rest, continued to work, finally went to bed, but by that time he was delirious and kept wandering from room to room. Still they didn't realise how ill he was. Nobody wanted to tell the Queen the truth. The doctors were terrified because she got hysterical so quickly. They wouldn't tell the Queen that they were very concerned about the prince's health. In fact, they lied. They said he was doing very well. If he managed to sort of take 2 mouthfuls of soup, they would say, oh yes, he's taking nourishment. You know, it's all looking good. And so, although the Queen was worried, very worried, she certainly didn't think he was a dying man. Princess Alice, who'd recently got engaged to a German prince, or duke, and eventually became the Grand Duchess of Hesse. She was the next one to get married. She became the angel of the sick room. She'd always wanted to be a nurse. Obviously she couldn't be, she was royal, but she had some nursing, she had great nursing skills, and she was the one that kind of looked after the prince. The doctor spoke to her, not to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was kept out of the sick room as much as possible because she just got hysterical every time she went in. She wanted to help and give her husband nourishment or a drink, but she was crying so much she really wasn't more. She was really in the way. She wasn't helping at all. She was actually getting in the way of the doctors. So Alice was the one who stayed with her father, slept in his room, read aloud to him, played hymns to him. She was very musical, so was the prince. She played on a little harmonium, she played his favourite German hymns, persuaded him to take food when nobody else could. And he deteriorated steadily. They called for the older children and said the Queen couldn't bear to be in the sick room for very long, had to be escorted out because she was upsetting her husband by being so hysterical, but still didn't understand that he was ill because the doctors kept giving these sort of encouraging bulletins. So she was taken by surprise when on the 14th of December he died. And there are various theories about his illness. The standard one is typhoid, because that's what the doctor said he was suffering from. Fever. First of all, they called it low fever. I mean, there are all sorts of fevers in those days. They didn't really know what they were, so low fever. And then they decided it was typhoid. The drains at Windsor were absolutely dreadful, so quite a few people got typhoid when they went to Windsor. He actually died of pneumonia. It was his breathing that was compromised. But what had really caused the problem, the last theory, which is about 4 years old, is that he had suffered for a long time from stomach cancer. Hence the agonising pains. Or irritable bowel syndrome, or celiac disease, or ulcerative colitis. But obviously without an MRI scan or X-rays or anything, they couldn't, or blood tests, there was no way of knowing. The Queen, as we all know, just fell apart. And it's now believed that she had quite a serious nervous breakdown as a result of her husband's death, on top of her mother's death. The court had only just come out of mourning for the Queen's mother, and now plunged into mourning for the Prince. The Queen never came out of mourning. She wore black for the rest of her life, which was kind of an exaggerated way of saying, you know, I shall never get over the death of my husband. Martin found some wonderful pictures. She insisted on the bedroom being left exactly as it had been during the Prince's lifetime. Every day shaving water was produced, everything laid out, warm towels for the rest of her life, the rest of her reign. That had to happen every day, which even in Victorian times was seen as sort of morbid. Her reaction to the children was she didn't want to see them. Particularly she didn't want to see Bertie, because she blamed him. She said it was all his fault. Her father had gone downhill, he was recovering, and he'd started to get really, really ill because of Bertie's fall from grace, as she called it, his dreadful fall from grace, killed his father. She said, I can't bear it to see him in the room. I can't see him without a shudder. I can't even bear to think about him without a shudder. An awful thing to say. And to pin all, she was looking around for somebody to blame, and she decided she would blame her son. So we will do more about this next time, and then we're going to do Disraeli. Well, Gladstone first. Gladstone was Prime Minister 4 times. Disraeli, Prime Minister twice. So we are going to do a little bit of politics and reforms and see, you know, what difference they made. O-level question, who did more for the country, Gladstone or Disraeli? A formidable question, actually, to try and cover both. So that's what we'll do next time, if that's all right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Just looking at the calendar, I reckon we'll probably get 2 more Monday sessions in before Judy goes under the knife. But we'll keep you posted on that. Thank you very much, folk, for your support. Take care.